Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to actually speak at a conference that's not in London. Absolutely love it that I can be a little bit more Yorkshire than I usually am, and I appreciate that you'll think I'm from the wrong side of the Pennines, but I'm from the right side. So I would love to share with you today some of my perspectives about being brave and taking risks. So Claire Marie asked me to talk about some aspects of my career where I felt I've been brave or I've taken some risks. And I sat back and thought, I don't think I've ever taken a risk, actually. I've just got on and done it. But as I started to write down what I'd done, I started to realise that, yeah, maybe I have taken one or two risks in my career. So I'd like to share with you some of those and how I got through them. I'd like to share with you my view of sustainable success within your career while you're continuing to take risks and you're continuing to be brave. I'm going to share some of my lessons and then let's see where that takes us. I walked into the room earlier on and heard that somebody was talking about Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. That was probably one of the first books I ever read when I started in banking, and I thought it was hugely helpful. But I wasn't reading it from a career point of view. I was reading it because I wanted to get rid of the boyfriend I was with, and felt that that was going to help me to progress that. So let me share a few points with you first of all. I mean, my belief around having sustained success in your career come down to 4 different elements. One is about taking risk. One is about how you manage your energy effectively and how you use your energy. That doesn't sound like psychobabble. We're not going to be singing Kumbaya until later on. But it's about how do you use that effectively, how you really focus on the right actions, and how you're really resilient and how you build your resilience up. So when I really thought about, I'm not really a risk taker. But when I thought further, I say yes more than I say no. Lots of situations, career and personal. Try to say yes as much as possible. I thrive on a challenge. And I always think if I've been offered an opportunity or I see an opportunity and I wonder whether I'm going to take it, I always think, how would I feel if somebody else took that opportunity and they got the spotlight and they'd done something that I wanted to do? And they're usually my key drivers to really make me decide whether I'm going to take a risk or not. In my early part of my career, and I'll share some of this with you, I had an amazing line manager who would always say to me, if there's only 2 things in life, Charlotte, you need to learn, it's how to be resilient and how to use your energy and be as productive as you possibly can. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. Where am I pressing? Oh, right, there we go. So, Leeds born and bred, and decided to leave school at 16. I was as bored as hell at school, and I just really didn't want to be there. Although there were opportunities to go to college and then university, I left school at 16. Started to work for a big bank within Leeds. Fast forward my life, I got the opportunity to apply for a change in my career. Still within that organisation, but a change in my career that would take me to a head office environment. And it would mean that I would need to work in London. Now, I was actually in the relationship with the person that I was reading the book about, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, and we had a long conversation about whether I should take the role in London, which would mean I would need to commute. And his response was, absolutely not. I don't want you working much further away from where you actually live. I'd rather you didn't. So, guess what I did? So I took the role down in London, and I think what's really interesting is how you take those steps and how they progress to the next level and the next level and the next level. So I took the role in London, worked in the city of London for a while, moved over to Canary Wharf for a while, and really loved every moment of it. I lost the relationship that I didn't actually want and didn't know how to get rid of it, but I also found lots of new ways of working and was really taken out of my comfort zone to really look at how I could work differently and what were the opportunities for me, given that everybody kept saying to me, you're a girl that left school at 16, no qualifications, where are you going to end up? So I ended up there for a while. Then my next risk took me here. So I then moved from retail banking and I moved into investment banking. I did that for a while in London, I did that for a while here on Wall Street, and I did that for a while as well in Japan. And if I hadn't have taken that initial risk of moving to London and doing the work in London, that wouldn't have pushed me to then be able to take the risks of working in investment banking. The people were very different. The majority of the people had been to a Russell University in some shape or form. I was sat on banks of desks with people that had been to Oxford and Cambridge University. I would constantly hide the fact I'd left school at such a young age and I'd got my degree from the Open University. I would hide all those aspects. But it gave me the opportunity to work abroad and gave me the opportunity to then see other cities. What was really interesting within that time were a couple of things. First of all, I found out that in America and Tokyo, people love the Australian accent and they hate the Yorkshire accent. So I was offered quite a few times to have elocution lessons so that I would sound more acceptable to my American and Japanese friends. As you can see, I didn't take that. But that was a risk within itself. The other challenge constantly as well for me there was to hide the fact that I hadn't been to university, because that was seen as a very elitist culture and was very expected that you would have gone to university. My view was I'd rather get work experience and do university at night school rather than get drunk for 3 years at university. My personal view. Then that took me on to taking some other risks. So the first one, Clemery mentioned about the work I've done on Women on Board. So I'm an advisory board member for Women on Board UK. But I also got the opportunity to work with Vince Cable when he was Secretary of State and the team to do an independent review of what executive search firms were doing on helping to get more women into board positions. So I can remember the day that I got the phone call. Somebody said, would you like to speak to Vince Cable? I thought, this is my husband having a laugh. But I'll take it, let's just be cautious, let's see what happens. And it was Vince asking me if I would run an independent review. Now, if we think about being brave and taking risks, before he'd finished the sentence, I said yes. As I said earlier, I say yes more than no. Sometimes that's got me into interesting waters, but I generally do that. And his response was, well, you don't actually know what I want you to do yet. And I said, yes, but all I know is I want the report and I want it to have my name on the bottom. And if somebody else does it and they've got their name on the bottom, I am going to be well hacked off for the rest of my life. So that put me into another realm of doing a lot of work on getting women into boards, doing far more work with the UK government to really focus on how we can push more equality. If I hadn't taken the previous steps, I wouldn't have been in that position to be seen as an expert to be able to do that. The next one was the NHS. Never worked in the public sector in my life. And people have views on public sector versus private sector. But I really wanted to get a non-executive role. I felt if I was talking about women getting onto boards, I had to do what I was talking about. I wouldn't feel congruent if I wasn't practicing what I preached. So I applied for a role in an NHS trust. That was hugely scary. For people how many people work in banking or have some experience around banking? Just a few. If you think there's a lot of jargon in banking, spend a little bit of time in the NHS. I spent the first year of that work not really understanding what the hell anybody was talking about. And I sort of knew that people were talking about really important things, but I didn't know what these different diseases were that people were talking about. I didn't know what the acronyms was, but just kept going with it. So a real risk for me was I didn't know the sector, and it was my first real experience of being on what I call a grown-up board. I'd done a lot of trust work and not-for-profits, but this was my first fully fledged grown-up. And then that moved me on to... Sorry, I keep going in the wrong place. That moved me on to this. So I decided to leave investment banking back in the end of 2012. The challenge was, and I just didn't see this as a risk, I saw it as a situation, but actually when I look back, it is a risk. I left investment banking in 2012. I wasn't expecting to leave investment banking. I went to meet my new chief executive of a particular investment bank I worked with in London, and it was my fourth chief executive in 4 years. And I was heading up the whole culture piece globally. So I was responsible for making more inclusive and diverse working environments so that people like us could progress in that industry. And I was just getting ready to go and meet my fourth chief executive, who was a Japanese man, and I knew I would be spending the next 25 minutes trying to convince him that this stuff was marginally important. And I'd spent 15 years convincing people that this was marginally important. So I went into the room. The first thing he said to me wasn't, "Hello, how are you? I'm such and such. I understand you're Charlotte." The first thing that chief exec said to me was, "So you're going to try and sell this to me, aren't you?" And I sat there and told him all the reasons why this was so important, and he shared with me why it wasn't that important given we were a Japanese firm, and Japan didn't see this to be as important at the moment, although that has changed now. And he was talking to me for a good 5 or 10 minutes, telling me about the economic crisis, the challenges that we'd had, and how every penny was so important. Now, being a Yorkshire lass, sometimes my mouth does things that my head doesn't realise it's doing. So out of my mouth very quickly came, "Well, I've got a great idea of how you can save a decent amount of money very, very quickly." And his eyes lit up and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "Make me redundant." And he just stared at me and said, "What?" And I said, "Well, I really can't be bothered sharing with you why this is so important. I can't be bothered to waste the next 2 years of my life to tell you that this is remotely important. So why don't I just leave?" The downside of that was I didn't get redundancy. The medium top side was, within 15 minutes, I was stood outside the door of the investment bank with my suitcase, because I lived down in London during the week and came home on a weekend, thinking, right, okay. Because the investment banking, you have to leave very quickly when you no longer want to be there. So I was stood with my suitcase thinking, oh, brill. And then I thought, oh, haven't told the husband. Haven't told the husband that we're not going to get paid this month or any other month. So that was, I don't see it as taking risks, but I think it actually was on reflection. So I did ring my husband and just say, look, it's a 3-hour trip back home, just to let you know I've resigned. You've got 3 hours to think about it. I'll see you about 6. So that was one risk. But what that pushed me on to do was create my own business and to create a group of organisations that are really focusing on diversity and inclusion and making sure that we create inclusive cultures. And what it actually gave me the opportunity to do was come out of London and actually start to do that in organisations up north, so that we can really emphasise the great work that we have here, the great women we have here, the great talent we have here, but also to really put the northern powerhouses on the map. So through having all those risks and challenging, interesting times in my career, it's effectively got me to where I want to be. So I would say back to you, being brave and taking risks is actually just part of your career. It's part of what you have to do. If you want a successful, sustainable career, being brave and taking risks are absolutely crucial. So let me take you through some of my other learnings. And one learning isn't that I press it here rather than there. So for me, fear is only temporary. So I mentioned earlier that on the phone call that I had about the Women on Boards piece, the first thing that jumped into my head wasn't, can I do it? The first thing was, how hacked off would I be if it had somebody else's name on it? That forced me to say yes. And then after I got off the phone to Vince, I thought, oh, right, how am I going to do that then? So it's about just jumping in and doing it. What's the worst that can possibly happen? I mean, the worst that could have happened there was that I was incapable of writing a report and the whole of the UK knew. But, what's the worst that could have happened in other situations? The next one for me is really taking risks. Susan mentioned earlier about, what is the worst that can happen in any of these situations? I think we overinflate what the worst that could possibly happen. To me, the worst that can possibly happen is nobody knows who I am and I'm not running and creating a successful business and we're not supporting getting more talented people up through the pipeline. That's the worst that can happen. Me looking or feeling a little bit embarrassed in an environment or a situation is nothing compared to the risk of not doing anything. The next one for me is really believing that you can do it. Even when really deep down, you're not sure whether you can. So whenever I start a project, whenever I start anything, I believe that I can do it and I go and tell somebody that I'm going to do it. Now the challenge with the work that I'm doing with many organisations up here in the north is that I inadvertently mentioned it on a Sky News piece that I was doing it. And after that came out of my mouth, I thought, oh, right. That's really got to happen now. So it's actually getting it out there, telling people what you're going to do, because you can't actually take that back. So once you tell people, make sure that you're really on the spike to deliver. And the other thing that I do is really focus on how do I visualize it. So what would it be like in 6 months' time or a year's time when I've done it? What's the end goal so that I can really visualize it, I write it down, and I make sure that I look at that on a regular basis to really make sure I'm going in the right direction. The other piece for me is just take the leap. As you can see from some of my stories, I don't usually think things through before I do things. People say take calculated risks. My view is if you're working out the pros and cons, my personal view is that you're thinking about it too much and too long. You either want to do it or you don't want to do it. You either want to have the success off the back of it or you don't want the success off the back of it. And just the one thing that keeps me going on that is, how would I feel if one of my competitors did that opportunity? What would happen if I had a great idea and one of my competitors delivered it? How frustrated would I be? So just keep doing it and just take that leap. What is the worst that could possibly happen? Now, I mentioned that early on in my career, a line manager said to me, the two things that are critical for your career are resilience and using your energy. So resilience for me is that bounce back ability. It's that knowing that you can just get back up when you've had a knock, knowing that you can walk into a room of people and you can talk about what's important to you, and whether they take it on board or not, it doesn't matter. At least you've spoken about it and you can knock back on that. Being resilient and looking after yourself to ensure that you continue to be resilient is absolutely crucial. There was a piece of research recently in the banking industry that talks about resilience of women. And one of the key aspects that came out of that was making sure that you're an optimist, making sure that you think about glass half full rather than half empty. And that's one critical piece around being resilient. The other one for me is your energy. So this isn't about kumbaya, but just a quick show of hands. How many people have been on lots of time management courses or read time management books that profess if you've got a 75-page to-do list, you can whiz through it in 10 minutes. And then you can go and skip and jump and enjoy yourself down in the meadows with the dog. How many have read books about time management or been on time management courses or they just do it? Okay. How many people have been on courses or read books that say, how do you manage your energy? A few of you. For those that haven't, I recommend that you take a look at Google and you look at energy management, because that really focuses on when are your peak times of performance in the day. When have you got your most energy? When can you do your brilliant work? If that's mine, I apologise. When can you do your brilliant work? And when is your downtime? So if anybody wants to get a copy of an audit, just a one-page audit, do let me know, because I'll forward it on to you. And I do this religiously every single day. I focus on how I'm feeling, scale of 1 to 10. 1 is I want to curl back up in a ball and go back to bed. And 10 is I'm on fire, throw anything at me, it's going to happen. And I look at when my ratings between 7 and 10 are in those scores, and 1, 2 or 3, and then I manage my work around that. So I get my most important work done while I'm really between 7 and 10 to make sure that I use all my energy effectively. So I would encourage you, when you're thinking about taking risks, really focus on making sure you're resilient, making sure you're focusing on using your time to the best advantage. The final thing that I will just say is being brave and taking risks is part of everybody's career. If you want to get on, you need to think about being brave, taking risks. I would challenge anybody that said they've never taken a risk. We all have different levels of risk, and we all have different appetites of risk. But I think the biggest risk that you can take in your career is actually not to take a risk. And I must be right, because Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook actually said exactly the same. So he said the biggest risk is not taking any risk. In a world that's changing really quickly, the only strategy that is guaranteed to fail is not taking risks. How we operated 2 years ago will not be effective now. How we operate now is not effective in 2 years' time. You have to take risks to continue to challenge yourself. If you don't take risks, you'll fall behind the back of the crowd. Thank you.